Hello everyone, welcome back. We are going to continue our conversation about the mechanisms of evolution in this third part of our lecture. So far we have discussed how evolution occurs. We have discussed how we measure evolution and detect if it's occurring in a population by looking at changes in gene frequency. What we're going to look at now are the foundations of some of those mechanisms that allow gene frequencies to change over time. In order for gene frequencies to increase or decrease, that implies that there have to be multiple different versions of a gene. Genetic variation is one of our foundations of evolutionary change. If a population doesn't have multiple versions or alleles for a gene, then that particular gene can't evolve in that population. So where do you get this genetic variation from? Where do these different gene forms come from? Well, there's two primary sources. The first, we've alluded to before, it's mutation. These are sudden changes in genes that can create either brand new traits or oftentimes just new forms of existing traits. For example, imagine our beetle population has always been green. It's always been green beetles for hundreds or maybe thousands of generations. And then one day, a brown beetle is formed, or a brown beetle is born. This little brown beetle is probably the result of a mutation in the gene for coloration in this particular species. If it's really beneficial to be brown in color, it's possible that this little beetle will be able to pass on this new version of the color gene to his offspring, and in turn, his offspring will pass it on favorably to their offspring, and brown coloration will become more common in this population over time. Our other source of genetic variation is migration. Migration is when immigrants are able to introduce new genes into another population. So let's imagine that we have our green population of beetles right here, but there's another brown population of beetles that lives nearby. Maybe they've been separated from each other by some sort of barrier. Maybe a mountain range used to separate them. And over time, a pathway was created through those mountains, which allows the brown beetles to move into the green beetle population and introduce their brown coloration to our previously all-green group. So these are your two sources for where genetic variation can come from. We've talked about how gene frequencies can change, but we haven't talked about the exact ways that they change or what causes that change. There's two major ways that genetic frequencies in populations can be altered. The first is called genetic drift. The second is called natural selection. Now, the first thing I want you to keep in mind is that both of these mechanisms, both of these are mechanisms of evolution. Okay, so both genetic drift and natural selection cause evolution to occur. Right? But they are very different. In genetic drift, the changes are only occurring due to random chance. You're randomly losing individuals who have a certain characteristic, not because that characteristic is bad, but just because those individuals had bad luck, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, they all happened to get sick. It has nothing to do with the characteristic itself. There's two ways that genetic drift occurs. It's what's called the bottleneck effect or the founder effect. And we're going to talk about those on the next slide. The key idea with genetic drift is it's pure chance, pure luck. Who lives, who dies. It has nothing to do with the characteristics or the genes in question. Natural selection is the opposite. It's non-random. If you have a characteristic that is advantageous, meaning it gives you an advantage, it's going to become more common over generational time because individuals who have it will live longer and they'll reproduce more, and their offspring will inherit that advantageous characteristic from their parents. Over time, these advantageous characteristics become common in the population such that every individual has them, and that's when we call them adaptations. Advantageous characteristics, once they become common in a population, are referred to as adaptations. And adaptations help you survive and reproduce. All right, let's take a moment and examine these two mechanisms of evolution in more detail. We'll start with genetic drift. Overall, genetic drift is when there are changes in gene frequency from one generation to another, and those changes are occurring entirely by chance. So look at our beetle example down here. We start out with a population of beetles that's both brown and green. Now imagine there is no advantage to being brown or green in color. The background they live on is, maybe it's gray, exactly like what you see here. So being green doesn't help you camouflage, neither does being brown. There's no advantage or disadvantage to having either of these colors. But one day, along comes some dude, and he steps on a big portion of this beetle population, smashes them flat. Just by chance, the majority of the beetles he steps on happen to be green. He could have stepped on these brown beetles back down here. If he had been walking just a few feet to the left, he might have smushed those brown beetles instead. Just by bad luck, the majority of the beetles he kills happen to be green. What this results in is a change in the frequency of this green allele in the population. There used to be a significant number of green beetles. Now there's only one. Automatically, you have lost a huge number of your green alleles just from this one freak event. It has changed the gene frequency in this population, and it counts as evolution. This actually happens to all populations. Usually it's not this dramatic, but over time you see changes in how common a certain fur color is, how common a certain tail length is. And it has nothing to do with whether those characteristics help an individual to survive or reproduce. It's just random fluctuations. If you look at the number of babies born in the US each year and examine how many brunettes are born, how many redheads, how many blondes, what you'll see is that over the course of decades, in some years, many more brunettes are born than blondes, and then in later years, more blondes are born than brunettes. It's not because one hair color gives you an advantage in life over another. It's just random chance. How many brunette babies happen to be born one year versus redheads versus blondes? The key idea with genetic drift is while it is a mechanism of evolution, it doesn't produce adaptations, and that's a critical thing. It does not produce adaptations. It's not favoring characteristics that help you to survive or reproduce. Instead, characteristics are becoming more or less common at random, okay? Purely by chance. Now, genetic drift can happen for a variety of reasons. It happens to every population, and it's usually fairly subtle. Just a slow change in the frequency of certain genes over time. And it's, again, very, very random. But there are two types of genetic drift that are more dramatic, and so they are given their own names. Now again, these are not the only ways genetic drift happens. These two forms of drift that I'm going to talk about, the bottleneck effect and the founder effect, just happen to be very unique ways that drift can occur. And so they're noteworthy to talk about because they are rather distinctive. In the bottleneck effect, some catastrophe kills off a big portion of your population. So it could be a large number, a significant number, let's call it that. Number of individuals in a population die off which changes the population's gene frequency. For example, let's imagine we have an island. I'm going to use the same diagram for both the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. And for now, let's pretend we have an island. And on this island, there's a certain type of bird, say. These birds are all the same species, but they all have a bit of variation in feather color. Some of the birds of this species have purple feathers. While other individuals of the same species have blue feathers. Now, there's no effect of color on how well these birds survive. It doesn't help them to camouflage, it doesn't help them to hunt, it doesn't help them in mating. There's no benefit or disadvantage to having blue or purple feathers. Now, imagine one day a big storm comes, some big, nasty, angry hurricane. And it wipes out a huge portion of the birds on this island, right? All of these guys get wiped out. Okay? So when the storm passes, this is what we're left with. When we started, I don't know if you were keeping track, but we had 6 purple birds, and we had 6 blue. But now, after the storm, those numbers have changed, okay? If we allow these birds to reproduce for a few generations and come back and check, here's what we'll see. There will still be blue birds, but there will be significantly more purple birds than there are blue. And the reason is just by pure chance, pure luck, more bluebirds died during that storm than purple birds. And it wasn't because being blue attracted the wrath of the storm. It was just bad luck. It just happened to have more blue fatalities than purple. So what was left in the population was a majority of the genes were now purple, and only a few were blue. If the majority of your genes are purple, that's going to become the more dominant characteristic. It's going to become more common, and that's a change in gene frequency. We call this the bottleneck effect because if you picture the shape of a bottle, a beer bottle or a wine bottle, it looks something like this. Okay. Imagine that this is time running along the bottom of the bottle, and that the height of the bottle, or think of it as the width here, represents the size of the population. So as you move forward in time, the population is nice and big until this point, the bottleneck event, where for whatever reason, a catastrophe, a disease, the population suddenly shrinks down to this size, and it's much smaller after this point. That's where the name comes from. Okay, so bottleneck effect is a significant number of individuals are lost from your population, and they take their genes with them. All right, now let's talk about the founder effect. In the founder effect, your original population remains intact, but a small group of individuals are removed from the original population and they create or found a new population in a new location. So I'm going to use my same diagram here. Okay, so there's our 6 purple. Redraw our blue. Okay, so we are back to our original of 6 purple and 6 blue birds on our original island. Now imagine that imagine a rowboat comes along. So there's our boat. Okay. And a couple of our birds get curious and they jump in this rowboat. They're looking for food, they're looking for adventure. For whatever reason, these particular birds all jump in the rowboat. So who we wind up with in there is 1 purple bird and 3 bluebirds. They're the ones who just happen to be close enough to see the boat. They're the ones who just happen to be in a position where they could get in the boat. And they're also now the ones who unfortunately get stuck in the boat as it starts to drift away from the island. Now eventually that boat is going to arrive at a different island. A brand new island that none of these birds have seen before. Okay? So these will be the first birds of their kind that make it to this island. There are plenty of resources, also plenty of room. So this is how our population starts. But if we allow the birds on this new island to breed for a dozen generations, and then we were to come back and check on them, that new island will look something like this. And I apologize, these blue dots should be empty. 1, 2, 3, there we go. So again, we let the birds breed, and then we check back in several generations, and maybe our population looks like this. Now, on our original island, we had equal numbers of purple and blue birds. But now on this island, blue is a far more common allele for color than purple is. And that's all because of the birds that just happened to get in the rowboat, right? It just happened to be that 3 bluebirds and only 1 purple bird hopped into this boat, and that was purely by chance. But those are the birds who founded this new population. Their genes were the only ones available to create this new group of birds. And since the blue allele was more common than the purple allele in this founding population, hence the name founder effect, blue became the more common allele in the population that grew from those few founders. So in the bottleneck effect, you lose a bunch of copies of a particular gene because of a big die-off, and whatever genes are left are what become more common in your population. In the founder effect, a small group creates a brand new population in a new place, and whatever genes they take with them are the ones that become most common in that new population. In both cases, the genes that become more common get that way just by chance. Natural selection is different. Natural selection is non-random. Organisms with characteristics that are better suited to their environment will tend to survive and reproduce more often. Now, I've been saying the words survive and reproduce, survival and reproduction, and I keep repeating them because these are critical ideas. They are what drive this process we call natural selection. But it's kind of a mouthful repeating them over and over again. So, of course, scientists came up with a term for this. We call it an animal's fitness, or an organism's fitness. Your fitness is measured as how good you are at surviving and reproducing. Has to be both. So fitness is a combination of your ability to survive and to reproduce. Let's use our beetles one more time as an example. Let's imagine that these beetles are living on a brown dirt lot. Okay, so the background that they live on is just brown dirt. Okay, there's no cover, there's nowhere to hide, they're just exposed. And in this environment, the green beetles stand out quite a bit. They stand out a lot more than the brown beetles do. The brown beetles camouflage, the green ones don't. And there are predators in this environment. Birds will eat the first beetle that they see. In this case, they're probably going to eat the green beetles preferentially because they can see them most easily. Over time, that means there are going to be fewer and fewer green beetles, until eventually we'll likely have a population of just brown beetles. If you talk about this in terms of alleles, we started out with maybe equal numbers of green and brown alleles. If any of these brown beetles up here were heterozygous, it means we actually had more copies of the green allele than the brown. But because of this predatory pressure, and the green beetles being preferentially eaten, and thus the green alleles being removed from the population, the brown allele became more and more common, in large part because it helped the beetles to survive. If you survive longer, you're more likely to reproduce and pass on your alleles to your offspring, who will then pass on those alleles to their offspring. That's why the reproduction part of fitness is so important. You've probably heard a very famous quote attributed to Darwin: survival of the fittest. This is a quote that refers to the process of natural selection. The argument here is, the implication here is that this statement is saying that only the fittest will survive. Fittest refers to fitness. That's where this term comes in. It's kind of a crap definition. It's not a great explanation of natural selection, and here's why. Fittest, this word, implies that you have to be the best. It implies that only the fastest survive, that only the strongest survive, only the best camouflaged, only the best at finding food, that you have to be the absolute best in order for natural selection to favor your characteristics. And it's not true. You don't have to be the best. You just have to be fit enough. You have to be fit enough to survive just long enough to reproduce and pass on your genes. You don't have to be the fastest antelope in the herd when the herd is running away from the lion. You just can't be the slowest, because that's the one the lion is going to catch. Any antelope that isn't at the back of the herd is going to survive, and survive long enough to pass on its genes. You don't have to be running at the front of the herd in order to get away from the lion. You don't have to be the best at finding food, you just have to be good enough at finding food to survive long enough to reproduce. You don't have to be the best at camouflage, you just have to be good enough that you avoid predators most of the time, and you live long enough to reproduce. You get a sense of how this works? Okay? You don't have to be the best. Survival of the fittest is really misleading because it implies you have to be the best in order for natural selection to favor your characteristics. Natural selection favors anything that gives you a little bit of an edge, helps you to survive a bit longer, helps you to reproduce a bit more. It doesn't have to be an extreme. All right, so these traits that are helping our animals to survive and to reproduce are what I called earlier advantageous traits. Remember, advantageous traits, when they become common in a population, we call them adaptations. So when is a trait advantageous? It's when the trait makes the organism better suited to its current environment. And that's a word I'm going to add in here. Its current environment. Because that's what's going to determine whether a trait helps you to survive and reproduce. It's how it works where you are right now. Not in an environment that's going to show up at some future date. Not in an environment that you existed in the past. It's current conditions where you live in this moment. Traits are advantageous when they make you better at finding food, or you're better at locating mates and mating with them. Maybe you're better adapted to your climate, you're better at staying cool in hot climates or warm in cool climates, or you're better adapted to your physical conditions. If you live in a really rocky mountainous area, perhaps you've evolved limbs that help you to balance on rocky inclines, like mountain goats. All of these count as adaptations. Now, what I'm going to give you here is an example of how evolution occurs. I'm going to use orchid bees as our example. Orchid bees are very interesting little animals. They are solitary bees. They live exclusively in the tropics. They can be semi-social, meaning they might nest near each other in small groups. And they're pantropical, meaning they're found across the tropics. They're very colorful, as you can see in these pictures. You commonly find them visiting orchids, but they're not exclusive to orchids. They will collect whatever flowers happen to be available in the environment, but what they're collecting are scents. Male orchid bees approach orchids and other scented flowers and use spongy tissue on their hind limbs to absorb the scent molecules from the flowers. And they actually mix the scents together and create a sort of perfume that's very unique and which attracts females and helps them to earn mates. The more elaborate the perfume, in some cases, the better chance the male will have of finding a mate. What the perfume tells the female is that this male is able to locate flowers, which of course are a food source, they have nectar in them, and that he's probably a good forager, meaning he's got genes that, well, if he passes them on to her offspring, will help her offspring survive. If he's a good forager, her offspring likely will be as well. The other unique thing about orchid bees, which they're famous for, is they have this incredible proboscis. A proboscis is a term for the mouth part that houses the orchid bee's tongue. It's this thing, okay? It is absolutely huge. In some orchid bee species, the proboscis goes the full length of the body. It's amazing, okay? This is how bees collect nectar from flowers. But usually the proboscis on the bees we're used to isn't super impressive. If you look at the bumblebee and honeybee down here, these are the closest relatives to tropical orchid bees. We have bumblebees and honeybees up here in North America. Notice their proboscis is significantly shorter relative to what you'd see on an orchid bee. Okay? So what accounts for this difference? Why do you have this absolutely massive structure, but only on this type of bee, not on all bees? Well, here's how it worked. It's very likely that ancestral orchid bees had a short proboscis, just like the honeybees and the bumblebees we see. Probably the ancestral bee, the ancestor to all of these bees, had this short proboscis too. And it worked well for short flowers. They could get in to where the nectar was, right here, just fine with this short proboscis. But one day, an orchid bee ancestor was born with a mutation, and that mutation resulted in a slightly longer proboscis. This wound up being helpful because this bee was able to access nectars in flowers that were longer and more narrow. So now this bee was able to forage still in these short flowers, and it could also forage in these longer flowers. It had access to more food, which meant it was healthier, probably survived longer, definitely was able to reproduce more because it had more energy, more food available to it. Over time, this benefit of having an increased food supply, which increased health and reproductive success, it caused the trait of having a longer proboscis to spread through the population over generations until it became the dominant characteristic, and all orchid bees had that longer proboscis. Then if you fast forward through evolutionary time, more mutations started to lead to more and more length in the proboscis. And each time it added to the number and type of flowers that the bees could forage from. In the tropics, there's a huge diversity of flower morphologies, meaning there's a lot of flowers that are especially long and skinny. These bees were now able to take advantage of all of these flowers, and it dramatically increased their food supply. It resulted in the proboscis becoming the dominant trait. The incredibly long proboscis is the dominant trait among orchid bees because it's improved their survival and their reproduction. It's improved their fitness. There's a few key concepts I want you to remember. Okay. Evolution occurs over the course of generations, generational time. Not decades, not years, not days, generations. Remember that some organisms have really short generational times, so we can actually see evolution occur in these groups much more rapidly. This also means that organisms that reproduce quickly, so they have short generation times, they're going to be able to adapt to a changing environment more rapidly. So these guys can adapt to a changing environment Animals with long generation times, like elephants, they actually evolve more slowly. So they may not be able to develop adaptations rapidly enough to account for, say, climate change or a new ice age. Next, remember that populations evolve, not individuals. Okay, so you're looking at how a population changes over generational time. And also remember that evolution, it doesn't progress in any particular direction. There's no end goal. It's not striving for perfection. Traits will only exist so long as they promote your fitness. If a trait is no longer beneficial, if it no longer helps you survive, you're probably going to lose it. Cave salamanders are my favorite example of this. So you have generally two groups of salamanders, the way this normally goes. You've got a cave, okay? And outside the cave, you have salamanders with eyes, living, normal salamander lives. But then inside the cave, you have another group of salamanders who are eyeless. This is the only significant difference between the two groups, is one has eyes and the other does not. It's pitch black inside that cave. Having eyes does not help the cave salamander survive. There are plenty of little insects and other organisms running around for them to eat, but there are other ways for them to hunt and find these food sources. They don't need eyes to do it. Eyeballs are expensive, energetically speaking. They take a lot of energy to grow, they take a lot of energy to maintain, and that energy comes from your food resources. Over time, the cave salamanders that were born with mutations that caused them to have smaller eyes or non-functional eyes, those salamanders actually did better inside the cave. If they were born outside the cave in full daylight, they would have died because their eyes didn't work well enough. But inside the cave, having non-functional eyes actually gave them more available energy to build up their health or perhaps to make more babies. Until over time, the eyes were very slowly lost from the population, until you wound up with eyeless salamanders who now had a bunch of extra energy available to them that they used to use on building and maintaining their eyes, but that they could now use on improved health or improved reproduction. Okay, so evolution, the fact that you can gain traits and then lose them, it means it doesn't have a direction it's moving in. We're not building towards some perfect organism. Traits only are maintained so long as they help your fitness. Okay, our next topic is how evolution is related to diversity, or the creation of new species. It's a process we call speciation. Speciation produces new types of organisms. Okay? It's the process of generating new species. One species can generate a lot of new species over time if the environmental conditions are right. What you need to have happen to generate a new species is reproductive isolation, which puts an end to gene flow between two groups of what used to be the same population. Okay? Now, there's two different ways this can happen, type 1 and type 2. We're going to talk through type 1 first because it's a good way to get a grip on how speciation occurs. Makes more intuitive sense. It's called allopatric speciation. This is when a speciation event occurs because a population is divided into two parts by some sort of physical barrier. There's an actual physical separation keeping these two groups away from each other. It could be a glacier, it could be a river, a mountain range, an ocean, but this is a physical barrier that the individuals in each population cannot cross. Okay? This is actually the main way new species are created. Okay, so here's how this goes. We start out with a population of beetles that have a whole bunch of different colors present. We've got really pale beetles, we've got brown beetles, we've even got some greenish beetles mixed in here. And a river suddenly appears in their habitat, and it divides the population into two groups. Just by chance, our pale-colored beetles wind up on the left side of the river, and our more green and brown beetles wind up on the right side. So we've got more pale-colored alleles on the left, and more brown and green-colored alleles on the right. So if we let these groups reproduce over a couple dozen generations and then come back and check on them, here's what we'll see. The most obvious change will be the color patterns. If you compare these two groups to the original, you'll notice that neither group really looks much like the original population anymore. This group on the left is significantly lighter in color. The group on the right is significantly greener and browner in color. Okay. The color differences just happen to be the most obvious differences. There are probably other differences present that we can't see. Maybe differences to their internal structures, differences in how they digest their food, maybe even differences in how they reproduce. Those aren't immediately obvious, but the fact that there are differences just in what color is dominant tells us that the genes that are becoming more common in each group are different. Now, the reason this happens is because the genes on the left side of the river in these beetles are no longer accessible to the beetles on the right side of the river. These pale-colored alleles can't cross over the river and be introduced to this group. Okay? Can't happen. It's because they're blocked from each other. Likewise, the green allele present here can't cross over the river and be introduced to this population. Right? It's because of that separation. In the original population, back up here, there was what we called gene flow between individuals. Here it is, gene flow. It means anybody could mate with anyone. Genes could be passed freely among all members of the population. But once this river moved in, gene flow between the two sides of the river ended. This means that the green allele that was on this side of the river was now unavailable to the beetles on the left side of the river. So none of them could be green. And there was no mutation that recreated the green allele. So they simply don't have it. The reason gene flow ended? Yeah, it's because these beetles were physically separated from each other. But what that prevented from happening was reproduction. This ended, or this isolation event ended reproduction. And I'm going to erase that arrow and say, draw an arrow going the other way. The fact that reproduction ended, that's what ended gene flow. Okay? These two groups are what we call reproductively isolated from each other. Okay, and that reproductive isolation is what ended gene flow. This is the only way you can get a speciation event to happen. The reason is, speciation is defined as a new group or groups of organisms are generated when a population is split. If there are genes being passed back and forth between the groups, they're going to become the same group again. There will be no uniqueness to the group on the left versus the group on the right. They'll all share every characteristic and remain a single big population. If that's not happening, that's the only way you're going to get two groups that eventually will develop so many unique characteristics within their group that when, say, the river finally dries up and the two groups come back together again, they will have acquired so many differences between them that they won't recognize each other as mates, and you'll wind up with two groups of beetles, two species of beetles that remain separate from each other, even if they start sharing space again. They have become so different from one another, they are no longer the same species. So allopatric speciation is kind of the easiest way to be introduced to this idea. But there's another form of speciation as well. I really like this one. It's interesting. It's called Sympatric speciation. It's a little weird because this is a speciation event that results from populations which become reproductively isolated from one another when they're in the same physical area. So these are groups that are not physically separated from each other. They exist in the same space, the same habitat, but they become isolated and don't interact with each other. There's a lot of things that can cause this. A small group of individuals in your population can start to feed in a different area from you. So they stop hanging out with you, they stop interacting with you, and they stop mating with you, and instead only mate with other individuals that feed in their little area. It could be a small group of your population start to mate in a slightly different season. Okay? Maybe you're a flock of birds. The majority of your flock mates in early spring, but there's a small group of birds that live with you and feed with you, but they don't mate until late spring. That's going to reproductively isolate them from the rest of your flock and eventually allow them to become a new species. You might be active at different times of day. Okay? Maybe your population is a group of predators who hunt at dusk, just as the sun is setting. But a small group of you get tired of competing with the others for food and you decide to wait until dawn to hunt. Usually you're probably going to mate with the individuals that you hunt with, so the small group that's now hunting at dawn are going to mate with each other and not those of you who hunt at dusk. The result of this is you're no longer going to exchange genes. So gene flow, once again, will end. Okay? Reproductive isolation is going to lead to the end of gene flow. If I were to ask you a question about this on the exam, speciation events, either sympatric or allopatric, if I were to ask you how they occur, you would want to make sure that you mention reproductive isolation and the end of gene flow. Both of those things would need to be in your answer for it to be complete. The end result of this lack of gene flow is you create a smaller, reproductively isolated group that eventually will speciate. My favorite example of this are apple maggot flies. Okay? So in North America, apple trees are not native. They were introduced by the Europeans, and they were introduced across North America. Now, apple trees happen to do really, really well in the same climate and habitat as North American native hawthorn trees. Okay, so this picture on the right is of a hawthorn tree and hawthorn fruits. Picture on the left here, that's an apple tree with apple fruits. Notice how similar they look? Well, there are flies that are common in North America that parasitize the fruit of hawthorn trees. We call them hawthorn maggot flies. It's lovely, isn't it? Well, these hawthorn maggot flies will mate with another fly. They'll lay their eggs on a hawthorn fruit, and then the flies that emerge will spend their lives flying around the same hawthorn tree that they emerged from. And eventually they'll go back, they'll lay their eggs on a hawthorn fruit, and their offspring will emerge and again hang out around the same tree they were born on. Well, when apple trees were first introduced, these hawthorn maggot flies, by and large, stayed on their hawthorn trees, but apple trees started to show up in the same areas as hawthorn trees because they grow well in the same conditions. And at some point, one of these hawthorn flies got confused, left its home tree, and laid its eggs on an apple tree. Those eggs hatched, created new flies, and those new flies spent their lives surrounding the apple tree. They'd return, lay their eggs on an apple, create a new generation of flies which also only hung out around the apple tree. You mate with the flies that hang out near you. So these flies that were accidentally born off of an apple tree only mated with other flies that were also born from apple trees. The hawthorn flies, by and large, stuck to their hawthorn trees, and it created two reproductively isolated groups of flies. Now, even though these flies are literally living in the same groves of trees, they're right next to each other on adjacent trees, they don't mate with each other. They don't even really interact. This is an example of sympatric speciation, a small group becoming isolated within the territory of a larger group. The flies that started feeding on apples became their own species, the apple maggot flies. All right, here is a good practice question for you. This is a thinking question. Okay? Sympatric speciation would occur under which of these conditions? Okay, so take a minute, read the answers, pause the video, and then I'm going to talk you through each one. All right, you ready? Let's see if A counts as sympatric. One part of a population mates in May and the other part mates in June. Yeah, that would work. The population lives in the same location. They're just mating at slightly different times. That works. That's sympatric speciation. What about B? Two populations live in the Mississippi River, one near the cold headwaters in the mountains and the other in the warm waters near the ocean. Now they're living in the same river, but are they really living in the same environment? One part of the population lives in a super cold environment up in the mountains. The other lives in a warm water environment down near the ocean. Cold adapted groups generally don't spend time in warm water, and warm adapted groups generally don't spend time in cold water. These guys aren't separated by behavior or changes in feeding or mating behavior. They're separated by a physical barrier. Temperature. This isn't sympatric speciation, this is allopatric. How about C? Two populations that are separated by a glacier? That glacier is a physical barrier. This is also allopatric. And how about D? D is my favorite. Half of the males sing in the morning, the other half sing in the evening, and females do not choose males based on song. Well, your first instinct might be to look at the singing behavior. You've got males singing in the morning, you've got other males singing in the evening, which could lead to females having a preference for either morning males or evening males. If females have a preference for one or the other, it means that females are only going to mate with either morning males or evening males, and that'll create two separate groups. But the second half of this question is the key part. Females don't choose males based on song. Song has no effect on mating behavior in this group. It doesn't matter. That means you're not going to get two distinct subpopulations based on song. According to the information we've been given, there probably won't be any speciation in this group, because we haven't been given cause to think that there will be a smaller population that shows up within the larger one, and there's no physical barrier separating the population into different groups. For answer D, there's no evidence that speciation will occur at all.